Hey, so when discussing chapter 2 of First Timothy, and specifically verses 8 through 15, there's some things to keep in mind. You have to keep in mind the context, author's intended meaning, and who the audience was, which was the church, which was a church in Ephesus, and some of the things that were going on then was the cult of Artemis and women's empowerment to a degree. So when keeping that in mind, some of these verses make sense. And also you have to keep in mind that some things are contextual, some things need to be taken literally. Which for a lot of this, I think some of the ways and things he was referencing was contextual, but there's a lot of things that are universal and should be done. Like starting off in chapter 8, therefore I want every man to pray lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. In this text, I definitely feel that every man should, when praying, be willing to lift his hands in prayer in submission to God and say, God, I am submitting everything to you as he's speaking to God. And that, yes, while lifting hands might have been more of a cultural thing, that's why I definitely feel that submitting and your posturing in prayer is incredibly important, and is what Paul was hopefully going for when discussing that a man should lift his hands in prayer. And also when it says that it should be done without anger or disputing, he shouldn't be making it about himself or someone in the room he's upset with. It should be about things that are needed in the community in prayer, or the people who need it, or even if it is something involving themselves, it's more of like a, Lord, please forgive me for what I've done, or even, Lord, please help me to be more like you. It shouldn't be, oh Lord, please help old man Rivers learn how to actually give. It should not be about that. Then moving forward, in verse 9, when it starts talking about how I also want the woman to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, and not adorning themselves with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothing. God here is talking about not dressing yourself up to make it about yourself, or to be like, oh hey, look at me, aren't I so pretty and great? It's more of dress yourself with modesty, humility, and humbleness. So that way when you do acts of God, the focus isn't on you. They go, man, what is different about her? And God's light shines through them. And so that's why you shouldn't be dressing immodestly and flaunting your body, or dressing with all, this material wealth, and having your hairstyle all, done up super nice and pretty. And it should just be modest. And it doesn't need to be like disgusting or unkept, but it should definitely be modest in how it is kept. And so then moving on from there, going over verse 10, which was but good deeds appropriate for the woman who professes to worship God, of her living a godly life instead of living a life of, oh, look at me, aren't I so pretty? Moving on to probably one of the more controversial verses of verse 11. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. And then just going to get into verse 12 here too, also of, do not permit a woman to teach, assume authority over man, she must be quiet. So this is where most of the controversy from chapter 2 comes from, are these two verses, because most take it in a very literal sense of a woman cannot teach, she cannot preach, she cannot assume a ministerial role in the church. She must be quiet and listen to man and listen to everything he says as law. Which is where my struggle comes in from, because I grew up in a very progressive church where we had children's ministers. Women were more than welcome to preach from stage and welcome to be on the main stage. And I feel that they have the ability to do that, and they can teach, they can preach, but where my struggles come in and where I'm starting to land, where I have landed in my opinion on this is that, yes, a woman can preach, she can teach, she can be part of, she can be a preaching minister, but she should not be considered in the role of eldership, as Paul clearly outlines in chapter 3, because he's fond of setting himself up earlier in his letters, and then getting to this point later of that an elder should be a man who, which he clearly outlines, what should be a man who is godly, has his household in order, and looks more like Jesus than most other men in the congregation. And so, following these outlines, I feel that the role of senior minister, if he is acting as both preaching minister and in a role of an elder in eldership, that it should be left for a man and not for a woman to fulfill that role, because eldership is very clearly outlined for the men to guide and lead the church. While yes, let's face it, if they're having a healthy household and a healthy marriage, they're going to be talking to their wives, and there is going to be a woman's opinion. It's not just going to be a completely male-dominated thought process. It should still be left to, as Paul has assigned it, of a man leads the church. And then moving forward, when it talks about, in chapter 13 and 14, when it talks about how Adam was created first, then Eve, and how she was the first one to sin and become a transgressor, and Adam was not. I mean, honestly, she knew that they weren't supposed to eat from the tree of good and evil. She has been told either by God or Adam herself. And yes, Adam was with her, as described in chapter 3, and he did nothing to do it, so he is just as equally as guilty. It's not all just Eve. But ultimately, when it then comes to, but the woman will be saved through the childbearing. She'll be saved through Jesus Christ, just as man will be. I think that's a fair assessment of that we will all be saved through Jesus Christ. And so my opinion overall is that yes, men should be lifting up their hands in prayer and be having a submissive posture. Yes, women need to be dressing modestly and not flaunting their beauty or wealth, and proclaiming the word of God with her deeds. Yes, women can teach and preach and fulfill a preaching role, but the role of eldership needs to be left, as Paul described, to godly men, and that Eve isn't at fault. Adam is just as much at fault. Yes, she was the first one to take the bite, but Adam did nothing to stop the situation. And then ultimately, we will all be saved through Jesus Christ. Thanks.